Good day. The single most spectacular event of the last week, one which has, by the way, received very little coverage in the West, has taken place in Beijing, where the Chinese Communist Party has been celebrating the 100th anniversary of its foundation. Now, these celebrations were marked by a series of events. Firstly, there was a video conference between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin, in which they agreed to an extension of the Chinese-Russian Friendship Treaty and issued an extremely detailed and very lengthy 11-page joint statement in which they outlined their perspectives on the world, the nature of their strategic partnership, and the very wide areas of cooperation which now exist between these two countries. I'm going to discuss this joint statement in a separate video. Another feature of these celebrations was a large-scale parade in Beijing, in which, amongst other things, China showcased its new J-20 fifth-generation fighter jets, which China claims are at least equal and perhaps even superior to the fifth-generation fighter jets deployed by the United States, such as the F-22 and the F-35. But perhaps the keynote event of these celebrations was a long speech delivered by the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, who is, of course, also the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, its Secretary General, in which he discussed the Chinese Communist Party's history, its achievements, its prospects, and its plans, but also, and very interestingly, put them in the context of China's history and China's civilization. Now, this is unusual. It is, by the way, unusual amongst communist parties in general. If you go back in time, for example, to speeches made by Soviet general secretaries during the period of the Soviet Union's existence, when they discussed the Soviet Communist Party, they did so very much within the context of Soviet history, in other words, the period after the Russian Revolution. They very rarely spoke about Russian history pre-1917. But in Xi Jinping's case, that is radically different. For him, the Chinese Communist Party is a structural element, not just of China's present, but of China's past, and that past extends back 5,000 years. But it is not just that this past that extends back 5,000 years, or rather not primarily that past, which extends back 5,000 years, which concerns Xi Jinping, and one suspects other Chinese officials also. It is China's modern history, which has, for the Chinese, a specific starting date, which is 1840. Now, before I discuss what Xi Jinping had to say, I'm going to make a few general observations about China and its history. Firstly, China, it should be said straight clearly, is the world's oldest state which has been in continuous existence. The Chinese state in its has an institutional history that extends back to the possibly the Xia and Shang dynasties, which existed perhaps 3,000 or more years ago, but definitely to the unification of China by the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, in around 200 BC. For most of the time that the Chinese state has been in existence since then, it has been the world's most powerful and most economically advanced state. I think this is something which most people who are familiar with China would agree, And it is also, by the way, the state which has by far the richest and most extensive historical records, a fact which is a reflection of its very long existence. So the Chinese, running up to the 18th century, were secure in their belief that their state had a very long history behind them and that they were representatives of a civilization that was stable and wealthy and advanced. And then in the 1840s, that changed. And here is what Xi Jinping had to say about this. And it comes right at the outset of his speech. The Chinese nation is a great nation. With a history of more than 5,000 years, China has made indelible contributions to the progress of human civilization. After the Opium War of 1840, however, China was gradually reduced to a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society and suffered greater ravages than ever before. The country endured intense humiliation, the people were subjected to great pain, and the Chinese civilization was plunged into darkness. Since that time, national rejuvenation has been the greatest dream of the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. When Xi Jinping refers to the Opium War of 1840, he is referring to a series of military aggressions waged against China by the Western powers, principally by Britain, in which, starting from 1840, the British forced China to import opium from British-controlled India in return for Chinese exports such as tea, and then gradually expanded their influence in China to the point where by the beginning of the 20th century, the entire viability and independence of the Chinese state had come into jeopardy, and where the entire structure of Chinese civilization, as it had previously existed, was visibly falling apart. This period was a period of profound immiseration for the Chinese people, and as Xi Jinping says, it was a period of profound national humiliation. Moreover, after the collapse of the Chinese imperial system as a result of the revolution which took place in China in 1911, the situation got even worse. China descended into a prolonged period of internal conflict with regional warlords dividing up the country between them, until in the 1920s a government led by the Kuomintang party to a certain extent succeeded in reuniting China, but became itself profoundly corrupt and very much under the influence of the external powers, principally Britain and by this time the United States. Moreover, those powers, the Western powers, were at this time in physical control of key parts of China. I have visited Shanghai, for example, and I have seen there the former international settlement which existed there, where you'll find many examples of Western architecture, and of course other territories of China, such as Hong Kong, Macau, Tianjin, and ultimately Taiwan, also fell under the control of other powers. Then in the 1930s, China became the target of aggression by the Empire of Japan, and a prolonged and very savage and ferocious war was fought on Chinese territory between the Japanese and China and the Chinese people as they resisted the conquest of their country by the Japanese. This war is very little known in the West, even though the casualties that it caused were immense, as well as the physical destruction, and despite the key contribution that it made to the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. So, by the 1940s, China was in deep crisis, and Xi Jinping's claim, and the claim that the Chinese Communist Party makes, is that they successfully reunited China and re-established it as an independent, great power and as a prosperous country, restoring, if you like, normality to the Chinese nation, bringing it back to a state of stability and peace such as it had enjoyed previously during the long previous centuries of the existence of the Chinese state. And here again is what Xi Jinping has to say about this. To save the nation from peril, the Chinese people put up a courageous fight. As noble-minded patriots sought to pull the nation together, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom movement, the Reform movement of 1898, the ETHEREUM movement, and the Revolution of 1911 rose one after another, and a variety of plans were devised to ensure national survival. But all of these ended in failure. China was in urgent need of new ideas to lead the movement, to save the nation, and a new organization to rally revolutionary forces. With the salvos of Russia's October Revolution in 1917, Marxism-Leninism was brought to China. Then, in 1921, the Chinese people and the Chinese nation were undergoing a great awakening, and Marxism-Leninism was becoming closely integrated with the Chinese workers' movement. The Communist Party of China was born. The founding of a Communist Party in China was an epoch-making moment which profoundly changed the course of Chinese history in modern times, transformed the future of the Chinese people and nation, and altered the landscape of world development. Since the very day of its founding, the party has made seeking happiness for the Chinese people and rejuvenation for the Chinese nation its aspiration and mission. All the struggle, sacrifice, and creation through which the party has united and led the Chinese people over the past 100 years has been tied together by one ultimate theme, bringing about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And that is, for Xi Jinping, and I suspect for most Chinese, the key contribution that the Chinese Communist Party has made. It reunited China, it re-established China as a strong independent state, no longer subject to control by the Western powers, and no longer the target of aggression by enemies like the Empire of Japan, and it has gradually, after much trial and effort and many mistakes and setbacks, succeeded in re-establishing China as the kind of economic and cultural powerhouse that it was before the descent into the abyss of the 1840s. And here you see Xi Jinping in his speech ticking off the various achievements of the party. Through the Northern Expedition, the Agrarian Revolutionary War, the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, and the War of Liberation, we fought armed counter-revolution with armed revolution, toppling the three mountains of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, and established the People's Republic of China, which made the Chinese people masters of their own country. The victory of the new democratic revolution put an end to China's history as a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society, to the state of total disunity that existed in old China, and to all the unequal treaties imposed on our country by foreign powers and all the privileges that imperialist powers enjoyed in China. It created the fundamental social conditions for realizing national rejuvenation. Through tenacious struggle, the party and the Chinese people showed the world that the Chinese people had stood up, and that the time in which the Chinese nation could be bullied and abused by others was gone forever. I ought to say that the reference in the speech to the Chinese nation standing up is a reference known to every Chinese, to a speech which Mao Zedong gave when the Chinese Red Army marched into Beijing in 1949 and the People's Republic of China was founded. He said at that point in that speech that the Chinese nation had stood up, and we see Xi Jinping repeating the reference in this speech. And this gives the clue to understanding the power of the Communist Party of China in China today. It is perceived by the Chinese people, or at least by a critical mass of them, as the party which restored peace, stability, unity and independence to China, and which has brought China back to the center of world economic and cultural development, such as it had before the collapse of the 1840s. You could say that for China, the period from 1840 to 1849, when the Chinese Communist Party established the People's Republic, was their equivalent of the decade of humiliation that Russia experienced in the 1990s. However, the key difference is that whereas for Russia the 1990s only lasted a single decade, for the Chinese their century of humiliation lasted for more than 100 years. Now, there are many criticisms that many people outside China can make about the Chinese Communist Party, and I have made many. I have visited China. I have seen the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party maintains an all-embracing control of Chinese life. I have no doubt at all, as I've said many times, that China is not a democracy in the way that that word, much abused as it has increasingly become, is understood in the West. I have no doubt, however, also that these words that a Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, is making carry enormous traction with the Chinese people. I have also no doubt at all that when he reminds the Chinese people of this long century of profound humiliation, they recognize entirely what he is saying. And when he tells them that the Chinese Communist Party led China out of this period of humiliation, that carries tremendous traction with them and explains the legitimacy and indeed the popularity that the Chinese Communist Party undoubtedly commands in China itself at the present time. And I think that irrespective of what happens to China in the future, there is no going back on this. I think that the Chinese that will continue over the rest of their time to insist upon the defense of their independence and of their own ability to control their own destiny. I don't think they will ever allow a situation to arise again where other countries succeed in taking over their history and establish what Xi Jinping calls a dominance over China that ended up in China becoming a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. And it also explains why the Chinese will push back so fiercely whenever they are criticized for anything they do by the Western powers. Take these words, for example, which appear in Xi Jinping's speech. We will not accept sanctimonious preaching from those who feel they have the right to lecture us. The party and the people will keep moving confidently forward in broad strides along the path that we have chosen for ourselves, and we will make sure the destiny of China's progress and development remains firmly in our own hands. In other words, they will not accept sanctimonious preaching from those who oppressed China before, who were in effect China's semi-colonial masters, in other words, the Western powers, and they are determined that their progress will remain firmly in their own hands. It may be that over time, developments in China will be such that the political system changes there. I would not be surprised to see that happen. In fact, I think it likely that at some point it will. But I am quite sure that there will be no going back on this. Now, where does this leave the world? Where are we actually going to move forward with this rise of Chinese power? Well, I think that for the moment at least, this rise of Chinese power has some way to go. I know that there are many people who predict and expect and look forward and wish for things to go wrong in China in a serious way. They hope that demographic problems, for example, will cause Chinese economic growth to slow down. They believe that the rise in debt within China will somehow undermine the growth and stability of the Chinese economy. They point to various aspects of China's political system and social system, which they collectively believe or would like to believe will eventually cause a crisis in China. Well, I think that all of these beliefs, whilst some of them may contain a grain of truth, amount to a heavy amount of wishful thinking. I think the Chinese economic growth is going to continue at a high rate for quite a long time, probably at least for another decade or two. And I have no doubt at all that China will emerge as a result of that period of economic growth as the world's biggest economy and its most powerful country. Now, how China uses that power will, I think, depend a great deal on the way that other powers interact with it. If we pursue in the West a policy of confrontation towards China, and when people talk about containment of China, it is confrontation that they actually mean, then we have seen the strong language that Xi Jinping has used about China not accepting bullying or sanctimonious preaching. The Chinese will push back because as far as they're concerned, all of that will be a reversion by the West to the behavior that caused China so much misery from 1840 to 1949, and which the Chinese have struggled so successfully and so hard to break away from. If the West takes that approach, then, as I said, we are indeed set for a new Cold War with a China which is going to continue to rise for the foreseeable future and which is going to gain increasing strength and increasing confidence. The other option is to engage with China and to continue to engage with China in the way that the West has done, but perhaps in a more realistic way than it used to do. it's always seemed to me that the United States and other powers previously assumed that China's rise would somehow be contained and controlled within the Western system. And of course, the United States made the extraordinary decision of opening its markets to Chinese goods in a way that facilitated China's rise, but which ultimately undermined the US's own industrial base. Well, rectification of that sort of thing, I think, is not impossible to negotiate with the Chinese. But I think that it has to be done, engagement with China has to be done with an acceptance that China is here to stay and that it is going to become increasingly wealthy and increasingly powerful. Now, there are some people, like the Western writer Martin Jakes, who I understand actually lives now in China, who say that the United States and the West are mentally ill-equipped to accept the possibility that a non-Western country could rise to this level and could displace the United States and the West as the world's largest economy and most powerful country. I hope that that is wrong, but it is for us to make that decision and to recognize the place where China has come from and where it is going. It seems to me that the key decisions about this are not going to be made in Beijing. I think there, the trajectory of travel is very clear. It is going to be made in Washington. Either we choose confrontation with China, in which case we will be locked with China in a Cold War, which we could very well lose, or it is realistic engagement, in which case I think that perhaps after some degree of friction, a stable international order could eventually establish itself. The decision is ours. We have certain very tough decisions to make in the West, but I think understanding China and where it's come from is a precondition to making those decisions wisely. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and I would ask you also to check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, ODYSEE, SuperU, and Locals. And also, please remember to support us to the extent that you feel you can via Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. Last but not least, please check out our shop and see the wonderful things we have there. And also, if you like this long video, please take the like button and remember to check your subscription to this video. And thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.